Good morning. It is 6:17 a.m. on Friday, October 12th, 2018. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. I think today I want to talk about something that is kind of a touchy subject. So I want to try to be careful and sensitive of how I talk about it. While recording talking about Survivor last night, Mike and I had someone join watching live and then commented into chat. And to give a little bit of context, Mike and I were both being pretty critical of one player in this season of Survivor in particular that kind of rubbed both of us the wrong way, where uh, this player is an African American woman, an older woman named Natalie, and we were both commenting on how she seemed to want to sort of boss everybody around, and everybody else on the tribe seemed to be resenting it. And we were basically critical of her approach to the other players for that reason. And that was the context. But the person who joined in the chat immediately jumped to, you know, it seems obvious that the only reason you're bashing Natalie is because of her race. And then proceeded to say that the way we were talking about her was rude and inappropriate. And I want to bring this up not to just sort of vigorously defend myself, even though I don't think we were being rude or inappropriate, but I want to sort of take a moment to think about a phenomena that I've heard discussed online known as white fragility, and the tendency sometimes for people to overreact, I guess, at the idea of being, having any hint thrown their way that they're prejudiced or racist in any way, and overreacting to the point where they kind of almost reinforce the issue. But in this context, we did address the comments in the episode, and I like to think that we handled it relatively well in the sense of we didn't ignore the comments, but we did raise that I don't think our criticisms of Natalie had anything to do with her race, but and further that I think what we were doing is specifically being critical of her behavior in the context of a competition reality show. And the criticism was specifically that she didn't really seem to be making any allies on her tribe, and that was going to be a problem, and that even though her tribe members chose to vote someone else out in that episode, they didn't seem to be doing so to save her so much as just to get the other guy out first. And several of the players said so, and I think our criticism of Natalie was all coming from that context, and certainly, at least in my mind, consciously, I was not aware of any connection at all to her race in my criticism of her. But that said, it is 100% true that people can have unconscious biases and unconscious prejudices. And so I didn't want to necessarily completely dismiss it out of hand. I think in the show, what I said was that I don't think it was fair for the listener to jump to that conclusion, especially if she had only just watched this one episode and joined in the middle of a conversation. Because Mike and I have been talking about Survivor for a long time, and so I think with added context, this listener would have probably known that Mike and I talk about many of the Survivor contestants in the same way when they behave in ways that seem not optimal for the game. Natalie is by far from the only one that we have ever been critical of on the show. Um, so I think but I tried to keep it cool, not to like get angry so much as to just say, to explain, I guess, what I explained just now, which was, I think that our criticism of her is very specifically limited to the way that she's performing in this particular game and what she did in this episode that we saw on screen, and that we were not imagining it. We were talking specifically about what were the other players saying about her on the show. But it's also true that sometimes these things are not, conscious, right? And so I wanted to think about it a little bit more. So, like, as the show was, as the podcast was over, I wanted to think about it a little bit more too. And I think one of the things that it is fair to maybe think about a little bit is that part of what Natalie was doing that was rubbing her fellow castmates the wrong way is that she was acting kind of bossy, and she had a tendency to very much keep her cool. And I think one of the things that I talked about in particular was having been in a situation where when you're having conflict with someone and you feel like they're being unreasonable, but they also just keep their cool to the point where, they don't raise their voice, they're not doing anything, but they are also being completely immovable and unreasonable. And I talked about how that can just be very frustrating from the person trying to have an argument with them, and it can end up making the person who is having a more emotional reaction feel crazy, and that's frustrating. And so I talked about that too. And so one of the things that occurred to me thinking more on it is that I think that is sometimes a stereotype for African American women and older African American women in particular, like this sort of, like, they have I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think there is a stereotype perhaps of the cold sort of badass older African American woman. I think that can be kind of a trope, and so perhaps the idea of criticizing someone for behaving that way could come across and even contain unconscious elements of prejudice. I don't feel like that's where my criticism was coming from, but I feel like it is worth thinking about, and I think it's also important to be able to talk about these things. So I'm trying to do my best. I'm certainly not perfect, but it was just something, I wanted to examine and not dismiss out of hand. I don't know. So I'm not sure I have any kind of definitive conclusion to draw on this subject. It's obviously complicated. But at the same time, I think, like my conclusion ultimately was that I think that this person who was commenting jumped in the middle of a single episode with Mike and I and heard us criticizing an African American woman and jumped to that conclusion. And I think it was probably further driven by, I imagine that person liked Natalie, and therefore, hearing us criticize the player that they like might have also contributed. But it's also true, I think, to recognize that sometimes these things can be unconscious and that it's worth doing a little self-examination. So anyway, I guess I'll leave it there for now, but excuse me, burp. But yeah, I think that, you know, it's important to think and talk about these things and to not always just uh, have your first emotional reaction be all that you think about when something like that happens. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now, and I will talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes.